specific strategy. Okay, after that, you will be able to hear specific strategies that they enact and have enacted at the elementary, middle school, and high school level, and also school leadership implications as well. And I'm going to start out first by giving actually each one of them. I was going to do it, but I actually want them to hear your voices. I want to give each of you 20 seconds to just share who you are with the folks in the room. And I'm going to start with Juan, and then we'll go with Dr. Maria, Arlene, Ms. Diaz, Shivi, and then Alicia.
Sure thing. Thanks again for inviting me, Crystal. So good to be with you all. My name is Juan Serrano. I use he, him pronouns. I'm social distanced, calling you all today from the unceded traditional territory of the Choctaw and Chimacha peoples. This is land colonial known as New Orleans, Louisiana. Former classroom teacher, lifelong advocate of education and young people and all people for that matter. And now I work for the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, where I help local governments apply a racial equity framework to their policies, practices, and procedures. So very good to be with you all today, and excited to share the stage with my fellow panelists.
Thank you, Juan.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Maria Kelly. I'm so delighted to be here today. I am an education consultant. I help schools and their leadership teams become more culturally responsive, lead with emotional intelligence, and also attain racial equity. In addition to that, I am the Assistant Director of Innovation at the Danielson Group.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Nkeyele. And I am going to go to Arlene, who is no stranger to KIPP New Orleans, y'all. Arlene, who are you?
Yes, if you were in KIPP New Orleans pre-2016, then you know who I am, but I'm introducing myself. And so reintroducing myself, I am a Brooklyn-based educational consultant, researcher, activist, herbalist, and I am just so happy to be here with all of you. I work at Teachers College Columbia University, where I support school districts and teachers with content area literacy, social justice, and trauma responsive education. I'm also the founder of the Awaken Collaborative and CEO, and I'm just so excited to be here with all of you and to do this work.
Thank you so much. And next, Ms. Diaz.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dorenice Diaz. I am an assistant principal at Camino Nuevo in Los Angeles. I'm based out of Los Angeles, which is where I'm from as well. I'm also a consultant through the Becoming Better Together collective. And one of the things that is a part of the fun stuff that I do that is also justice oriented is I'm one of the moderators for a somewhat popular social media page called Latino Rebels. So if you've ever seen some of the work that we've done, I might be behind some of those posts. Nice to meet you all. Nice to be here with you.
I love it. I love it. All right, Shivi.
Hey, my name is Alfred Shivi Brooks. I am a high school economics, personal finance, and government educator hailing from Clayton County, Georgia. I live in the Metro Atlanta area. I am the founder of an organization called Teachers for Good Trouble, which is a teacher advocacy collective that has a national scope. Also one of the board members of the People Uprising, which is a grassroots movement here in Atlanta, where we do activism and policy work here in the city and throughout the state of Georgia. It's a pleasure to share space with you guys, and thank you, Crystal, for inviting me to be here.
Absolutely. And last but not least, Alicia.
Good afternoon, KIPP New Orleans family. Thank you, Crystal. My name is Alicia Williams, and I'm a 6th grade social justice educator for KIPP Houston. I work at KIPP Prime. I'm also the founder and CEO of Teach Woke, an education consulting company based in Houston. We are also a global brand, and I'm excited to share the space with you all and dive into some conversations together.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And so we're going to dive right in, y'all. The first question I have is for you, Dr. Nkeyele, and that is, what is culturally responsive instruction? And I think that's so important to have really clear working definitions for what it is and what it's not, because we know that there is a vision that Dr. Gloria Laston Billings set for the pedagogy. All right.
I thank you. I so appreciate that we're starting off with a working definition of culturally responsive pedagogy for two particular reasons. One, energy flows where attention goes. So we want to make sure that we're giving our attention to the right actions that are going to lead to promising practices for students of color. And also, since engaging in culturally responsive work is a journey that has various ups and downs, when we have a working definition, it's easier to withstand the ups and downs of a journey when you can see the North Star. So this is why we want to begin with what is culturally responsive pedagogy. So I like to break down the words. So when we think about culture, we think about our values, our attitudes, and things that we consider normal. When we think about responsive, I like to help people think about being a first responder, that you have the intention and skill to deal with whatever's in front of you. And the word pedagogy is an approach to teaching. So when we combine those things, culturally responsive pedagogy is an intentional and skillful approach to teaching that values the culture of Black students and students of color. And I want to reiterate or iterate that it's a successful approach utilized by teachers, white and Black, by the way. So when Gloria Ladson-Billings did her seminal study, she studied the successful teaching practices of white and Black teachers of African-American students. So her working definition has 3 tenets. One is that students must experience academic success. So how do you know you're engaged in culturally responsive pedagogical practices? Students are experiencing academic success. So it goes beyond just making students feel good, that you actually see academic results. You're able to move students from where they are to where they need to be, and you actually see growth in their practice. Now, the second thing is that students must develop and maintain their cultural competence. And in essence, what that means is I shouldn't be embarrassed about my culture. When I go into a classroom, I should be proud of my culture, where I'm from, my identity, and my histories and my values. So teachers see students' lives as an asset. They see students' lives as a foundation for creating experiences, and that they foster positive racial and cultural identities. And the last tenet espoused by Gloria Ladson-Billings is that culturally responsive pedagogy helps students develop a critical consciousness. They help students question their society, critique cultural norms and values around what is reproducing economic or social or political inequities in society. So for a teacher to say that I'm a culturally responsive teacher, you have to be able to engage in these 3 things. So I like to say, "and" is your best friend here. So does it count if a teacher is just focusing on academics and compromising the emotional integrity of their students? That's not culturally responsive teaching. Does it count if a teacher is just focusing on social justice projects and we don't see any growth in reading, writing, or speaking abilities of the students? So really thinking about moving forward as you conceptualize culturally responsive teaching and you organize the energy in your schools, you want to think about 1 and 2 and 3. So thank you so much, Crystal.
So first of all, I mean, I'm over here going emoji crazy with the reactions. And I know that my friends who are fellow panelists had a lot of joy on their faces because it matters that it is all 3, right? And so often we know that first tenet gets missed. And so we thank you so much for centering us in what the actual intention and origin of culturally responsive pedagogy actually is and what it's not. And so that's incredible as a segue to then go to Arlene next, to really talk about at the elementary level. Arlene, sometimes there can be a feeling that children from pre-K to 5th grade are too young to engage in discourse that builds their racial identity, too young to examine systems of oppression. And then teachers may also wonder, how do I do that alongside needing to address these academic standards? Walk us through 2 to 3 specific strategies of things you were able to accomplish at Kippley Primary with small children and still reach those academic results, the first tenet of the pedagogy.
Sure. So I would say that the first thing I thought about was that When it comes to curriculum, we don't teach curriculum. We don't even teach children. We bend curriculum in a critically conscious way to meet the needs of our students and to meet the outcomes of their academic gains and success. So when I thought about like how that could be possible for students, and as I continue to work with students, what I continue to think about is starting with knowledge of self and love of self. So I always ask myself, how are children able to see themselves, love themselves, and recognize where they are in the margins of anything that I share with them? So that begins with children really understanding their identity. And in grades K to 2, pre-K to 2, that looks like starting with, who am I? Who am I on the outside? I have locks, I have brown skin. That's what people see when they look at me. Now, who am I on the inside? People don't see that I'm a Haitian American woman. People don't see that I am patient. People don't see that I'm creative. I would have to engage in dialogue for people to come in on the inside. A text like The Skin I'm In by Bell Hooks hits on this, where she says, the skin I'm in tells my story, but it doesn't show you who I am. If you want to know, you've got to come inside. So starting with that, and then moving on to, what am I around? Who is in my community? So that's thinking about family structure. That's also thinking about, location, geographical location, and having kids understand and have a certain pride about who they are and where they're from. And also thinking about the things that they like to do. So once children start with that foundational knowledge of who I am and fully embracing who they are, I then invite them to notice who the characters are in the books that we're studying. I also invite them to think about the kinds of problems they want to solve in the community. Children are acutely aware of injustice. And so by sharing with them, by giving them space to share their voice and visibility, they had the opportunity to name the things that are disturbing for them in the community that they would like to change. And once they're able to do that and look at texts to do that work, I invite them to consider Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop's work, which is Mirrors and Windows. So is this text a mirror for you where you can see yourself out on the outside, on the inside, your community, what you're around and what you care about? Or is this text a window where you're seeing someone else? And we know that texts where children see themselves are culturally affirming because representation truly matters. And we know that texts where children see others allows them to develop compassion, the ability to recognize the universality of humanity and the things that other people go through, and also become culturally competent in other cultures. So by giving them the opportunity to do that head and heart work, which is what I always try to do with my kids and what I continue to teach, is that there are academic strategies like knowing a story arc, being able to recognize character feelings, character actions, character thoughts, but there's also heart work, like, where do I see myself in this text? Where do I not see myself in this text? What does this text make me want to do in my community? How has this text changed my life, right? So I think choosing the right books to do that work is really helpful for children. And also when even thinking about math instruction, what kind of problems are we solving? And what are the ways that we can honor our many ways of knowing to solve those problems? And inviting kids to have a multimodality, the ways that they come to know the truth about things, and really taking a facilitator stance to study how they do that. And so that's a few examples of how I do that work with K-2 students.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Arlen. Such rich insight and very specific, guidance around how we can approach the work in an elementary setting. And I want to go to Alicia to kind of build on that. By the time our students get to middle school, can you talk us through the middle school, instructional moves and strategies that you've taken, especially because you're coming from a science background. So what does that look like, right? Walk us through that.
Yeah. That's a really great question. So I want to take you all back to 2016. So it's my first year in the classroom. I came into teaching through Teach for America. And the first lesson that I would do when I taught fifth grade science was, who is a scientist? Like, what do they look like? What are they wearing? What are they doing? And my school is 90% Latinx and 10% Black. And as I would do this lesson year after year, and I would walk around my classroom, I would see my students drawing pictures of a scientist who was white, a scientist who was male, a scientist in a lab coat with goggles, because that is what they have been socialized to believe what a scientist is. And so immediately, how do we begin to shift students' paradigm to see themselves as scientists and engineers and astronomers and all of these different things? So I knew that I had work to do as a science teacher. And so one of the ways that I did this in an instructional practice that I still do to this day was aesthetics, right? So when you walk inside my classroom today, when you looked around the classroom, we saw scientists of color who contributed amazing things to our world, right? We also featured a scientist of the month, right? And so those are things you can do in your classroom to begin to see representation of your students. The second thing I would do is like make content engaging. How relevant is your content? Our kids in here half sleep when they're in your classroom. And so instead of talking about, our space unit, all my science teachers know, my very educated mother just served us nachos. We know the order of the planets. I learned that in 3rd grade, okay? So how can we make it more engaging for our students? And so instead of talking about the solar system in this very traditional way, how can we begin to think about how our ancestors used the sun to create complex civilizations? And they use the sun in some cultures to pray, and they use the sun to build beautifully complex systems. And so when we're talking about the water cycle, right? Like I do a lot of kinesthetic movements, even in social justice now, where we can talk about the water cycle, right? Evaporate, condensate. And like my kids know the song, but how can we also incorporate the Flint water crisis or the flood or the water crisis that's happening in Jackson, Mississippi? So we have to look beyond the standard, and that's not going to be in your standard. But how do you look beyond the lines and think about whose voices are missing, whose experiences are missing, and how can we begin to incorporate knowledge that our kids feel empowered to change? And so as a result of them learning about the water crisis, my students organized, they came together, they made posters, and they sent over 1,000 water bottles to students in Flint, right? And that happened in a science classroom. And so those are things that I would incorporate into my classroom. And if I could leave folks with a few tips on just like, what does this look like practically, in person, virtually? I don't know what's going on. It's a lot that we have had to learn in the past couple months. But I would say 3 things would be: 1, classroom aesthetics, right? Who you post in your classroom and your PowerPoints, it says a lot, and it says a lot of nonverbal messaging around who is valued in our space and who is not. And so I think personalizing your like welcome message, so when students enter your classrooms virtually, right? Like welcome them, have them collaborate on a welcoming space, have them do your banner in Google Classrooms. The second thing I would think about is routines, right? And so how are students set up for success? So every day when kids come into my classroom, like there is music. Some days it might be Beyonce, some days it might be Roddy Ricch, right? But we vibe and they get connected and they get excited. And the one day I forgot, they were like, Miss, where's the music? Because they expect, right, music to be played when they come into my classroom. Lastly, I would say student agency. Do students have choice, right? Are you giving them choice when it comes to articles that they're reading? Are students safe enough to like ask questions, to disagree? And how are you continuing to build those spaces in your classroom so that you can be an excellent culture responsive teacher and have academic excellence, critical consciousness, all at the same time? Is so important in your classroom.
Thank you, Alicia. This space is so powerful for so many different reasons, and I want to keep it going, right? We've gone elementary, middle, and high school is next. And so Juan, you taught here in New Orleans. You're also from New Orleans, right? I want you to talk about the high school version of that, and should be the exact same thing there in Atlanta. Like, as high school educators, what are the instructional things that we should be leaning into doing for all the high school educators on this call?
Thanks, Crystal. First, let me just say shout outs to Black and brown women who are continuing to lead this movement in spirit and vision. Really, I would echo so much of what has already been shared. I would say, as a person who's from New Orleans, also as a person who identifies as Black, though I don't present Black in every context, it's very important to understand that my story and my reality, my lived experience in New Orleans might not necessarily be the same for all of my students, right? And so when I think about designing my classroom, my vision first is designing a space that is a multiracial, just, democratic classroom that's free of exploitation and oppression, and one in which all of my students, especially my students of color, can thrive with a sense of purpose, power, and dignity. And in order to steward that vision, it starts before my students even arrive in the classroom. It's doing the deep personal work, getting a sense of who I am in relation to the road ahead, right? Checking my own biases and reaching out to, my own communities to find healing in myself, because my own trauma plays out in these spaces. And as a teacher, as a facilitator of learning, there's an incredible power dynamic. And so we must be able to interrogate that and address those traumas before we work with students. And I think that's so important to being first responders, right? And to apply a trauma-informed lens to the work. But in addition to doing that sort of work internally, it's also reaching out to the students' former teachers before I even meet my students, right? Getting a sense of who they are, what their passions, their curiosities are, what their perceived limitations are. Also, if you have rosters ahead of time, reach out to your kids, get to know about who they are and their stories, and how surprised they would be when they show up on the first day and they see a class that they haven't been in before, but feels so much like home already. And then when students do arrive, it's important to make them feel seen and feel heard and help them feel a sense of belonging, right? And when we apply a trauma-informed lens to this work, it's also acknowledging that education has so often been harmful to our students. And so many of our students have suffered from either teachers that perhaps didn't care, or systems that, really limited the teacher's ability, even the best of us, to be able to serve them wholly. So we have to acknowledge the harm that's done and be willing to co-create better ends with our kids. And the way that I did that in my class, just to give you all some hopefully practical strategies to do that, is first I helped kids, I reflected on my own leadership development programs that I've been a part of. I'm also a former Teach for America core member. I'm also an Education Pioneers fellow. I was also a part of Urban Leaders Fellowship. And the sort of values activities that we did to identify our values, I did those with our kids. But it wasn't just identifying those values, it was taking them and overlaying them with the designing process of our classroom, right? What are the rules that we care about most? What are the procedures that matter most to us? How do those things enhance our ability to, as what's been shared already, put a mirror to ourselves and understand who we are, both as people and as a collective, right? And taking that and overlaying it with the school's code of conduct, right? One thing that was painful for me working in a charter system was how punitive our behavior systems often are, the point systems that are associated with those, right? And so getting kids to understand their values and lift up the classroom rules that matter most to them was really important for me to help, get a sense of, or help them co-create this space. I also helped, facilitate kids taking leadership personality tests and bias exams. That was really important, because even as a teacher myself, my own biases would show up in those exams, as it does in my own classroom instruction. And using myself as an instrument for learning to help level the playing field there was really important for kids to realize that this is something that we're all in together. And I think that shared power is so important. And then moreover, helping kids identify some class jobs, right? And I'll get into that a little bit, just about how I did that through project-based learning. But jobs is so important. And then also democratizing information and influence over the outcomes-based goals that we create, which might have something to do with academic or behavioral-based outcomes goals, but also procedural-based goals, right? How often are my students, who are a subcommittee within the class, a steering committee of sorts, these are students who are elected by their peers, how often are they meeting? And how often am I, as a teacher, meeting with their parents, their guardians, their families, and being clear and holding myself and our students to that. And then as we do the work, I will say that I've taught in public, private, charter. I've taught in the United States. I've taught international, and in New Orleans specifically, I taught a social justice class that was all about getting kids to engage in public policy, recognizing the issues around them, and working with local judges to be able to present solutions to them. And when we do that sort of work, it's all about getting kids to identify the problems that matter most to them. And over a series of projects, they learn who they are in relation to the world around them. They work with elected officials, they study inequality that's built into the structural environments, and then they research and present solutions on anything that they care about, anything at all, from income inequality, food deserts, to aliens, right? But getting kids to find the things that they're most passionate about and see the community around them full of the assets and building power together to ultimately achieve transformational results was my approach. So hopefully I provided some things that are tangible there, but yeah, I don't want to take up too much time and space. Please, Shivi, take it away.
You're muted.
Thank you. It's when you get that gray box across the screen that's like, hey, you're on mute. But Juan, thank you so much for sharing some of the things that work for you at the high school level. For me, I teach economics. And so there are, it's a little bit of kind of piecemealing of many of the things that I've seen share in this conversation. Alicia kind of discussed like how aesthetics really matter. When my students walk to my classroom, the first thing that you see is my classroom door decorated with a mural of Nipsey Hussle. And what that does is it gives a sense of ownership and understanding that there is not one formulated look as to what it is to be an entrepreneur or a person who can have impact on economics within your neighborhood. And I believe that, we can really use some of the individuals that have been on the forefront, but of the culture of our students so that they see themselves in it. Now, for me, for econ, I mean, that could be one of the most boring subjects if you don't teach it right. And so what that looks like in my classroom is using something that matters to most young people and definitely matters to me, and that's sneaker culture. So everything that I do in my econ class is really wrapped around the selling and reselling and marketing of sneakers. And that's one of the things that really crosses cultural boundaries and gives students an opportunity to kind of have access to the curriculum because they're interested. And so we're teaching virtually right now. So we do a thing called shoe and tell. So we'll go grab our favorite pairs of shoes, and we're talking about which shoes have what type of resale value, or why these shoes are our favorites, or why one may be more scarce than another. And so on its face, it could kind of seem like, oh, it's kind of silly, but these kids spark up. These kids get interested in sharing something that really matters to them, but that all of us can really relate to. And it ties everyone into kind of sharing what's important to them. What I love about using things that matter to kids within our curriculum is that you give your students the opportunity to present themselves as their authentic selves. Your students don't have to walk to your classroom and decide, am I going to be academic or am I going to be myself? Too often we make children decide who they are when they present themselves to the classroom. And they have to choose like between that duality. And unfortunately, it creates an adversarial relationship with school, and it's too often why we lose the interest of a lot of our students, because they feel like they have to compromise who they are in light of being who they believe they'll be accepted as. So my challenge to all of the educators here is to really tap in on what are the interests of your students and seize every single opportunity that you have to infuse that within your pedagogy, infuse that within your lessons, infuse that in how you give direct instruction. And in my opinion, this is how you create a home for students within your learning environment, how you can end up having the most fruitful outcomes while utilizing culturally responsive pedagogy.
Thank you so much, Shivi. Really appreciate that. And, I am excited to take everything that we've heard from Arlen, from Alicia, from Shivi, and from Juan, and transition that with an overlay of leadership, right? School leadership, hearing from Ms. Diaz, but then also want to tap into, a discourse with you, Juan, and you, Ms. Diaz, specifically about our brown students, Because so often when we use the terminology black and brown, black and brown, black and brown, right, we're still focusing on black more than we are brown students, even if we have just 5 students in a classroom or 17 students in a school. I would love for the two of you to talk about, and starting with you, Ms. Diaz, you know, what are the missteps you see when it comes to culturally responsive instruction and just work in general? And what are the needs of our brown students when we are having this conversation?
Thank you for that question. I think there's a lot of different stuff that I could touch on, but I think one of the things that for me is most present is the missed opportunity that educators are not necessarily entering into culturally responsive pedagogy through a lens of curiosity. And so when I walk into some of our classrooms and folks are saying like, "Hey, I'm teaching our students about Latinx leaders," really trying to scrutinize and say and problematize who are these leaders and do they actually represent the backgrounds of our students and the experiences of our students. And so I'll share a bit about my own journey. Like growing up in Los Angeles, I'm Nicaraguan and I grew up in a predominantly Mexican American community and then transitioned to working. My first school that I worked at was in East Los Angeles. So I was very familiar with the culture, very familiar with what it meant, what experiences were like for our Mexican American students that were either first, second, or third generation oftentimes, and then transitioned to working with majority Central American students in MacArthur Park. In the MacArthur Park area. And so when I got there, I was super excited because I'm like, this is my people. Like these are Central Americans who share a lot of similar experiences to mine. And when I got there, I had a really big realization around the fact that not only are our histories and our stories not a monolith, but oftentimes the content that our students were interacting with in their ethnic studies classes, in their Latinx and Black studies classes, were also the stories of the oppressors of a lot of our students' families back home in Guatemala. And so that's one of the things that to me comes to mind, that it's like when you are engaging in culturally responsive pedagogy for all students, but I'll speak in particular to working with Latinx students, is to really combat the idea of a cultural monolith and really enter through the lens of curiosity and trying to understand whose narrative is missing in this classroom, whose narrative is not being approached. I'm gonna be real, I'm tired of hearing the same stories over and over again. If you're still only talking about Cesar Chavez, Frida Kahlo, Jaime Escalante, like that's done. And the reason why I share that is because oftentimes these identity markers for some of these folks, many of them are lighter skinned Latinx folks who experience nearness to whiteness and who had that in so many different ways. Where are your Berta Cáceres? Where are your Pili Thomas? Where are your Silvia Rivera? Where are your queer elders that are also present into this space? And are our students understanding the intersections of all those things in one? How can they see themselves in some of the leaders that you're presenting in front of them, some of the community members, and not just single folks, but actual groups that were mobilizing multiple things within our communities. And the second thing I'll share is also taking into consideration how our students, how our children, how our families are creating culture in this very moment. And one of the biggest things that's an easy entry point for folks is oftentimes music. And when we think about music with a lot of our kids, I have this like small group with some of our students where all we talk about is reggaeton and how much we like reggaeton. And to sit there and to talk to some of my students and have them understand that none of them knew who El General was, but all of them knew who Bad Bunny was. And I'm like, we're missing the opportunity to understand the roots of this and really we're watching culture and the silencing of culture happening right in front of us. Whatever happened to reggaeton really tried to outcast Black Latinos that were presenting this, that were creating this content, and is now dominated by white Latinos in this space. So how can we have those complicated conversations with our students that actually affect their lives on a daily basis, because we see how colorism, we see how anti-Blackness, how anti-Indigeneity lives within the way that our students are experiencing school. And I think that the classroom is a beautiful space to have those conversations, because I'll speak for myself. I know that whenever I would bring it up at home, oftentimes it was not safe for me to talk about that because it meant like, wait, so you don't love being Nicaraguan? It's like, no, I love it, but like, hold on, mom. Like, can we just talk about why Black Nicaraguans don't have the same experiences that we have in this, why we don't have access to these forms of privilege? And so I think that's one of the missteps that I see oftentimes, that we walk in and we think that representation is the entirety of culturally responsive pedagogy. But really what we're teaching our students is a method with which to approach and become curious and be more critical about how culture is developing right before their very own eyes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And Juan, would love for you to follow up with that, especially having experience here in New Orleans, teaching and educating Vietnamese students, like brown students in New Orleans, right? Like, can you speak to your experiences in terms of missteps that you see happening and things that you think are important for us to be mindful of as we are educating those students as well?
Sure. It's going to be so hard to follow what Diaz just said. I will certainly do my best, and I'll be quick. But I think essentially the thing that's what's already been said, and I'll just underscore, is that Latinx students and Black and Brown students are not a monolith, right? These are communities that are incredibly diverse in terms of race, culture, political orientations, and so much more, right? And so the goal I see of teachers, or I think the missteps of teachers, is one, thinking that they're a monolith. Two, in their instruction and through their liberation work with students, they are erasing the histories of these very diverse sets of folks, right? And so I think my goal has always been to build bridges between communities, right? And that starts by identifying shared struggle or shared lucha between communities. Also, addressing our own internalized anti-Blackness wherever you fall on that spectrum, right? Because we know that these things they cut deep and they're wide and pervasive. And also recognizing that the new New Orleans, that is the New Orleans that is being formed right now, that is constantly evolving, and the New Orleans that will be, is one that is empowered and fueled by all communities. When I think about just how diverse New Orleans is, I can't deny the fact that part of what gives it such strength, in addition to its cultural and historical heritage, is the economic contributions of our Latinx and our Southeast Asian immigrants and business owners, right? This is so important to understand. And recognizing that all of our communities have, there are so many through lines between our struggles living under a police and carceral state, recognizing that where there are police, there are ICE, right? And ICE affects, students that are Latinx, but also students who are Southeast Asian in New Orleans, right? And just being clear about those through lines and how there is, again, this shared struggle, and getting kids to recognize that, one among us, our liberation is tied to all of our liberation. And so those are some of the general thoughts that I share. I will also say that the biggest lever for me in teaching kids is, I come from multiracial parents. My mother is a very fair-skinned Black woman. My father is Mexican. I actually never met him, right? So I've grown up slowly in my Black identity, not knowing what it means to be a Latino. And I'm still coming to terms with that and recognizing that, again, my body and my spirit is an instrument for learning, and being completely transparent about, what I know and what I don't know, right? And so I think those are sorts of the missteps and opportunities as I see them.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Juan. I want to go to Dr. Akinyele and back to you, Ms. Diaz, to speak really briefly to school leaders, instructional coaches, folks in the space that are really coaching and developing the capacity of teachers. What are the things that we need to be mindful of in those roles to create the conditions for this to happen?
Sure. So I think the first thing is really situating teachers as learners. And when you situate teachers as learners, that means you have to give them time to learn, to fail and practice. So because of the nature of our schools, we're always inundated with so many initiatives. And this work around culture responsive pedagogy is external application. We're actually learning strategies, but it's also internal transformation. So I have to unlearn my biases. I have to unlearn my anti-Blackness. So really giving space for teachers to have those discussions around the unlearning and being aware of new ideas, and also really giving teachers this time and the space to learn about their students. One of the things that came up from what Ms. Diaz has said is you really have to be responsive to who's in front of you. So my approach as a teacher last year might have worked with a particular group of students, but when I'm a teacher this year, I might have a whole new batch of students who are a different ethnicity or a different cultural background. So I have to have time in my schedule to really interview students, to really get to know my students. So I would say the two biggest recommendations I have for leaders is structuring time for teachers to be learners rather than just doers. So moving from I learned this in a workshop to immediate implementation, to really give time to cultivate that practice. And I think that would mitigate the implementation gap that we see in schools. So the implementation gap is I learned something and then I'm supposed to immediately implement it, but that's counter to how we actually learn and we actually engage in sustainable practices that positively affect students of color. So given time, and that means saying no to other initiatives to prioritize culture responsive instruction in schools.
Thank you so much. Ms. Diaz, what would you add to that?
I think one thing to add that is the importance of partnering with your teachers, genuinely partnering with the teachers that you coach or the teachers that you might not coach, but who you have access to at your school. So I think for me, what that has looked like is co-creating units together and giving each other feedback on how that went with students. That really takes off a lot of the weight of us being perceived as the folks who are just here to evaluate or to grade our educators in that way, and really looking at this as a collective learning experience for both of us. We are both educators in this, and we are both responsible for what our students do and do not learn. I also think one of the things that has been really powerful, especially within this pandemic, has been my ability to scrutinize my schedule and make sure that it reflects who and what matters most at my school. And so when I'm deciding how I use my time as a school leader, it's more than just meeting all the marks and making sure that I meet all the different compliance metrics, which, believe me, my role as a special education administrator and the EL administrator at the school, well, the compliance is heavy, but the presence is what really fuels me so that I can be able to then look at those reports and say, behind every single one of their students' names comes a narrative that I got a chance to experience, a person who I got a chance to get to know. And the last thing I'll say, especially that for me has been relevant in this time, is to model what we mean by taking care of yourself. I think oftentimes I'm seeing a lot of like PDs right now around self-care, but then school leaders still not necessarily modeling what that looks like for our educators. What we don't understand is that when we live that out, we give our teachers permission to do that themselves, to do that in ways that are unapologetic, to do that in ways that center their own wellness, their families. I always have my dog next to me and he's making all kinds of noise and nonsense. And so when I look at that, I'm just like, I don't care if your baby is near you, your husband is passing by, your grandmother comes to drop you off a bowl of oatmeal. Like, you are experiencing life at this time while also like having to educate in this way. And that, like, I'm privileged to be able to have access to your home in this way. So that's one of the things that to me means a lot. As a school leader, really trying to combat a lot of these things that have to do with the perceptions of who is in power and who is not in power. Oftentimes when we come into this, there's so much imposter syndrome that school leaders of color have when we come in, and we think that we have to fit this particular mold because it's what was done before us. But really, the mold that is necessary is the mold that you create, the vulnerability that you present, and the ability for you to be your full and complete self with your educators, so that they can then be able to see themselves as hopefully a future school leader that is approaching it in a similar way or in a way that seems true to them.
Oh, let me tell you something. If I can just pass a collection plate around, because y'all are just literally blessing all of us, such insight, such knowledge, such wisdom, such concrete, guidance as well. I want to go to Shivi and Arlen with a specific question, and then we're going to open it up for you all to utilize the chat. And you can also begin to do that now, like populate the chat with questions that you have, so I can kind of tease them out and pose them to the panel. Shivi, like you teach in Georgia. We're here in Louisiana. Louisiana has a mandated curriculum. Arlen, you've been a KIPster. You've been in KIP New Orleans. You know how KIP New Orleans rolls instructionally, right? What do you say to the educator who says, but I have a tier 1 curriculum. I can't do this. I hear y'all, but I can't do this. Would love for the two of you to speak to this idea of where and how culturally responsive instruction fits in, even though you still can be hitting academic standards.
Well, first, I would like to say it depends on the risk that you are willing to take as an educator first. Ms. Arlene earlier said that, essentially we kind of bend our instruction, right, as we're exercising culturally responsive pedagogy. And I believe for some, it looks different. It's almost like in how we all engage in activism or in doing the work. It is a spectrum. It's not a monolith. We don't all do it in the same way. Just 2 days ago, I was outside marching at the Capitol here in Georgia, fighting against voter suppression laws. Everyone's not going to be on the front lines, and especially on a Friday when it's raining and it's early in the morning, right? But that's how I'm willing to show up. Someone else may be willing to fund something. So when it comes to the classroom, some of us may want to stay in alignment with the standards or the curriculum. Some of us may follow it, but then give nuances to what we understand the truth is. But my personal belief is that if we actually want to decolonize the curriculum, if we actually want to shift or change things within our schools, never mind it. Teach it the right way anyway. And that's how I operate in my classroom, unafraid. One thing we have to understand as educators is the truth is that teaching jobs are abundant. We have a shortage of 800,000 teachers in America. Teach unafraid. Teach the truth. And if that school system doesn't want your services, if that school doesn't want your services, then get a job somewhere else, because they want you. Somebody wants you. And someone is going to let you show up as your true and your authentic self. And you do not have to compromise who you are for the sake of other people's comfort, for the sake of colonized curricula. Tell the truth.
Yeah. Thank you. And Arlen, I want you to come behind him and share your thoughts and your perspectives too, because something that comes to mind for me, Shivi, when I see the work that you do and when I have seen firsthand the work that Arlen does, is that culturally responsive instruction is actually harder, period. People can see it as supplemental, it's an add-on. It's actually more rigorous work, because I can teach a child, for instance, to regurgitate what year the Civil War started or began. But to say, how do I as a teacher bring in a primary source, secondary sources, all these things, so you can hear the perspective of Black folks in the Northeast during the Civil War versus Black folks in the Deep South versus this white perspective versus this white perspective, and then do all these other things, that's more work. That's beyond the standards, because the curriculum honestly is a baseline. It's not the bar.
100%. I would.
Instruction is the bar.
If I could tap back in on that, because being a Black educator, a liberator in the classroom is harder to do. When we are teaching our students, especially if you teach a standardized tested area, I have to teach my students the colonized curriculum and how to answer and bubble in the right answers on that Scantron or on that test, right? But I also have a responsibility to tell them the truth. So they have to know what is being required of them to be able to continue perpetuating some of the lies, but they also have to be told what the truth of the matter is and know the difference.
Yeah.
And so it is a duality, which I spoke about earlier, that our students have to walk into the classroom with, but they should also have a better understanding as they leave that classroom.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they will continue being dangerous, because let's be honest, Black and brown people sometimes can be some of the most, the worst perpetuators of white supremacy culture ourselves. And it's only because of our miseducation and our not knowing the difference between what is the truth and what is right.
Yep, that's right. And here's the thing, Arlen, I want to tap you in right behind what Shivi shared, because everything that you shared, Shivi, connects back to your opening PowerPoint, Dr. Maria, particularly the second and the third tenets. Do we give students opportunities to examine systems of oppression? Do we equip them and build their capacity to know what to do with it? Do we build their cultural competence, right? And so thank you for that. And I want to go to Arlen. Arlen, what are your thoughts, particularly being a KIPster in KIPP New Orleans? Is it possible to provide culturally responsive instruction?
Absolutely. Without a doubt, it's possible. I think the first thing you have to do is make peace with the system that you're in. And as an educator, you have to make peace with this notion that your intellectual capacity, your professional license, your autonomy is compromised when you are given a tier 1 curriculum. And to own that and to recognize that and to invite your students then to examine the ways that you as a teacher are oppressed, to question, like, who wrote this curriculum? What does this curriculum assume about us? Assume about me as a teacher, assume about you as a student, and whose voices are privileged and whose voices are marginalized? What kinds of texts am I given? And so when you make, it's sort of like you're leading from the trenches, like you make peace with that, you know, I am leading from the trenches. I recognize that I'm in a situation where we have to have a mandated curriculum. And if I choose to teach in this particular system, I can be complicit in that. I can locate myself and say, I am a teacher in a system that doesn't allow me to use my autonomy to make these kinds of decisions. You own it, you recognize it, it's looking in the mirror. And then you say, what do I have to do to, what about this curriculum supports me? Because not all curriculums are completely terrible. If you're trying to build the plane as you're flying it, which when we founded KIPP Primary, that's what I was doing, that's not easy. You're spending the whole night writing curriculum and also teaching. And there's a lot that can be a lot of things that you could miss, but you could see yourself as an editor of the curriculum that you've been given. You can look at it as an editor and you could say, what do I need to revise? What do I need to supplement in this curriculum if I am in no position in this particular system to supplant it? And that is just something to own and recognize. And that is the work that people in the Underground Railroad did. That is the work of freedom fighters. If I'm going to be shoulder to shoulder with my people, if I'm going to be in these trenches with them, how can I operate in a way that provides our liberation? And even inviting kids to do this work. I was, with a group of students recently who said, is school oppressive? And we deconstructed it. And they said, we didn't pick the lessons that you're teaching us. You haven't asked us, what do we want to learn? And so having that conversation with the admin, with the school, for them to recognize that, it's like, what do the kids want to learn? Let's stop and ask them. And how does the curriculum support what the children want to learn, right? And how does the curriculum support us? And so when I say bend it, what I mean is to bend it to your needs, because you can't do everything by yourself. It's really hard. I tried it for years. It's really hard to try to come up with every content area. If you could find resources to support you on your journey, vet those resources in a culturally responsive way. Ask whose voices are privileged, whose voices are whose voices are marginalized, who's telling the story, how are they telling the story, and what are the implications for our students if we only teach it this way? So I would say, don't pull and plug the curriculum, really dismantle it and see which parts you're going to keep and which parts you need to, not used to cause educational trauma to your students and to yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Arlen. And y'all, I invited questions, as you know, from everyone in the space. Now, I did get responses. They weren't questions. I have a lot of stuff coming via direct message, and it is like, yes, 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 needed this. Thank you. Like, it is a lot of affirmation. And I want to say that out loud to each of you as panelists, because everything that you have shared has been a gift to us. And you've been your full authentic self in sharing that. So I say thank you on behalf of every single person in this space, because people have really been supported by it, affirmed by it, pushed, all the things. And so we're going to close it down because I want to be on time. It's 4:27 Central. And so I know Shivi and Ms. Diaz and Ms. Akinyele are on different time zones. But, oh, and Juan, are you here? Are you here, Juan? Okay, because I know you travel a lot. So here's the deal. I want to close by giving each of you an opportunity to share what, nugget, gem, advice, piece of encouragement, et cetera, do you want to leave with the space today, right? Because we have a lot of folks. We have principals, we got instructional coaches, we got teachers in their first year, we have veteran teachers, et cetera. What do you want to share and leave with folks? I want to start with Dr. Maria. And I'll give each of you 30 seconds to do it. Go ahead, Dr. Maria.
So I would say that make the decision of committing to culturally responsive pedagogy as an oppositional pedagogy. It's not just a checklist of things. It's taking a stance to say that my students can be successful under conditions that I create. So really taking a stance on that. And then also really remaining optimistic. The world is it can be very hard at times, and we can be cynical, like there's so many things that I have to do, but really understanding that we have choices, and every choice that we create for our students creates more choices for them. So maintaining the optimism that you have for your students, and also really committing to this oppositional pedagogy because it works and it's successful for our children. Thank you.
That part. I love it. Thank you so much. I want to go over to Juan. Juan, you're next. 30 seconds. What do you want to leave in the space?
Just a ton of gratitude and appreciation for you, Crystal, holding this panel, and for all the panelists who just shedded their light and wisdom. I would say to the group, listen, you're enough and you're not alone, right? In order to be there for our students, we have to metabolize this system that we are all participating in. So take care of yourself and do so unapologetically. And again, you're not alone. You are among other activists, organizers, and revolutionaries. You work for and with your students. So onward and ahead. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you. I want to go to Alicia. Hey, you're next. What do you want to leave?
Yeah, thank you all for the space. This was really great. I'm taking notes, so thank you. But I would ask, and my charge to you would be, what will your students say 10 years from now about your classroom? Will they say your classroom is liberatory? Will they say your classroom created disruptors? Will they say that your classroom helped them navigate white supremacy and dismantle it? What will your students say about your classroom and your space? And I charge you, as we are living in such a unique time, that we don't have to do things the same way. Yeah. We can reimagine a liberatory, anti-racist education for our students because they deserve it.
Thank you. It's so good. Look, I need to go lay down after this, except I can't. I want to go next to Shivi. Shivi, what do you want? I know I'm like, I just want to sleep. Okay, what do you want to leave with this space?
One of my favorite adages especially when it comes to education, just relationships with students, is that young people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And students know how much you care when you show up authentically and give them the space to show up authentically too. Mm-hmm. Students don't care much about how much you know until they know that they can trust you and you have made that learning environment a safe space. Mm. And most importantly, we have to create cultures of hope within our classrooms. where students believe that the things that we tell them, the things we offer to them to aspire to are actually attainable. And we don't just tell them that it's attainable, we show them how to attain it. So if we can do those three things, if we can help them have more trust in us, if we can create a culture of hope, and if we could also help them to show up as our authentic selves as we do the same, your students will be all the better for it. You will have a long-lived impact on their life. So thank you, Crystal, for giving me the opportunity to share today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And last but not least, Ms. Diaz.
Thank
Actually,
you.
no, Arlene.
Oh, no. Yeah.
I was like, wait a minute, Arlene, after you.
Got it. I think, go for it.
Okay. I also want to thank you, Crystal, for having me. And it's so nice to be back at KIPP New Orleans Schools in this capacity, and just to be here to share with all of you. I would say two things. Number one is to recognize and honor your students' full humanity as well as your own. Teach them to love themselves, to accept themselves, to know themselves fully, and to learn all that they need to know about their history, but also about their genius. And recognize that we don't empower kids. We give them the tools to embody their inherent power. So don't be a savior, be an uplifter. And know that children can support you in your liberation as much as you're supporting them in theirs.
Yes. Ms. Diaz, come on.
I'm so glad she talked about power. Because what I want to say is that you have a lot more power than you might think you do. And that power only multiplies itself when it becomes collective power, especially when that collective power involves families, involves parents, involves community members and students, especially within the charter world, I'll tell you that. But also one of the things that I'll share with y'all is that when you use that power, you are bound to make others uncomfortable. I've never worked in a place where everybody liked me, where everybody was like, oh, she's real good. I've always had people call me disruptive, had people call me pompous for the things that I say and for the things that I believe and how I run my school. And when I see those things, that's a lesson that I've learned from living in earthquake country, is that when the earth shakes, it's breathing because it needs to release. And so if there's shaking within your organizations, within your schools, within your classrooms, it's because there is that necessary release that needs to be there. That discomfort is an opportunity for people to learn, but it is not always your responsibility to teach the folks with positional power. It is your responsibility, however, to be able to teach and work side by side with the folks that are in your classroom and in your community.
Whew. I have so much love for each of you. I thank you for your closing words. I thank you for everything you've given to this panel. You are friends, you are family, and I thank you for being present in this space and gifting KIPP New Orleans with your brilliance and your genius. So this concludes the panel. I hope this was a great use of your time, everybody. I'm sure you will be surveyed about this panel, so light up the survey, okay? What you liked, what you appreciated, but really, really appreciate you all showing up after school virtually in this way. So y'all have a blessed rest of the day. It's a virtual round of applause.